Hello everyone, Pepperfish is here. I am back with a new podcast, obviously, and today I wanted to talk about something that I've been thinking about for a while, ever since I had the podcast about stories that made me physically react to them. So there is one particular story that really stuck in my mind after I made that podcast that I realized I forgot to talk about. And part of the reason why that particular story really gave me a physical reaction is, in general, the whole storyline and how well it depicted that storyline. So what it comes down to, actually, that I'm going to talk about today are storylines that I generally like to avoid for different reasons, and it really comes down to two. So there are two main storylines that I tend to avoid. And one of them is, first of all, drug use. So the movie that I forgot to mention in my last podcast that I physically reacted to with general nausea and discomfort is, of course, probably one of the best examples of movies just about drug use as their primary topic. It would be the movie Requiem for a Dream. So this particular movie is something that I had heard about in college. I remember when it first came out, a friend of mine went and saw it, and I was really tempted to go and see it because it sounded really crazy. And he, went and saw it. He told me later that the end of this movie is the last 10 minutes or 15 minutes of this movie is like watching, hell on earth, that type of thing. And I remember just being like, oh, well, that's kind of crazy, And of course that was during my time period where I was really interested in watching really crazy movies. So I eventually did watch it, and really the whole time I was uncomfortable, slightly nauseous, and seriously by the end of it, it was so depressing to watch. And that's kind of what it comes down to. I tend to find stories about drug use to be really depressing, particularly since so many of them depict the drug use cycle, particularly of illegal drugs, how it turns really into just a story about someone's life spiraling out of control, and there's usually a great amount of physical sort of sickness involved. And in general, just the whole storyline I find, just to be somewhat repulsive in a way, which is partly why I tend to avoid stories about drug use. So other examples of this would be something like Basketball Diaries. I remember watching that and just being like, yeah, not doing it for me. No interest. I never want to watch this movie again. I have no particular interest in doing so. And of course I watched it, and then I was done. I was good. Okay, yeah, not gonna, put this one back in. Another example would be something like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. I remember someone, for one reason or another, watching that movie and just being like, oh, okay, again, it wasn't that entertaining for me. And one particular aspect that was somewhat interesting, but also not interesting, was the sort of perspective of the character types of sequences when they're under the influence, and you're just like, oh, the movie's all tripping out. And in the end, I have no particular experience with that, so I can't really relate to what I'm seeing. So I'm just like, oh, it's kind of entertaining, but at the same time, it's not entertaining. Generally, what I find, though, is stories about drug use are much more interesting if there's something else going on. So one of my favorite movies of all time is The Wall, the Pink Floyd's The Wall. And that movie does very much have to do with drug use, but there is also a lot of other things going on in that movie. And the story itself is about someone's mental journey, but the story isn't about drug use and its effects on someone's mental journey. It's more than that. That's definitely a huge part of the story, but it has more. There's more going on. Like I said, I'm not going to do a whole analysis of Pink Floyd's The Wall, but because that would probably take forever. But in the end, I really am interested in stories that couple the topic of drug use with something else. So another example that might be a little bit more fun would be the movie Go, which I remember seeing a very long time ago, and just like, this it was so much more entertaining as a movie to watch, because yes, there's drug use. There's even sort of that point of view under the influence sequence type of thing where someone's totally tripping out, and you have really just a number of different storylines that have to do with drugs, but they also are storylines where you have people going to parties and people trying not to get arrested, and there's more going on to this story than just focusing on sort of the depressing, spiraling out of control that a lot of just about drugs movies, those types of things tend to happen. And also, I'm mostly focusing this topic on movies because those tend to be where I find or come across stories that talk about drug use. I definitely do avoid books, of course, that are on the same topic, but mostly I hear more about movies that are on this topic. My next storyline that I tend to avoid are stories about cheaters and infidelity in general. So it's kind of, infidelity is such a pervasive storyline in so many of our, mediums of storytelling. So they're in books and they're in movies, they're everywhere. And we have some very interesting and oftentimes hypocritical perspectives on cheaters, and how morally we might accept their cheating or not accept their cheating. But honestly, I just tend to avoid stories that are just really about cheaters, and that here is the movie or the book or the short story where it's someone's struggles with their infidelity and maybe repairing their marriage. Again, another really depressing, very depressing storyline, and I just really have no particular interest in watching it. So, I can't really think of a lot of examples off the top of my head because this is how much I try to avoid it, where I actually don't watch the movies. I remember there was one with Diane Lane and Richard Gere, and she cheats on Richard Gere, who is her husband, and her lover ends up causing some issues later on, and so she ends up killing him. And it's really, it's such a strange story. And I remember watching this being like, okay, that's an interesting, exploration about why women might turn to a lover instead of to her husband. But at the same time, I'm just kind of like, yeah, story about cheating, not really interested. That just sort of falls into your lap sometimes, and you end up watching things you're not really interested in. At the same time, one of the more interesting examples that I have found that I think really kind of does make cheating kind of interesting to me is this book written by Margaret Atwood called Lady Oracle. And this book is so good. Of course, Margaret Atwood is a really good author, and this book is kind of hilarious. It has many stories within stories, and the main character is a girl who we visit sort of at different periods in her life, and at one point in time she is married, and her husband, I really hate her husband, okay? He is the type of guy who wants to make her feel stupid, okay? Because he's insecure and, he feels powerless and all this crazy, annoying things, all the things that I hate about men, wrapped up into this one guy. And so, of course, when she starts cheating on him with this crazy, artist, I'm totally just like, hey, go for it. I feel totally happy that you are, dissing your husband. You're being all disrespectful and you're running off with someone else. And, of course, this always makes it interesting how sometimes you can side mentally with the cheaters when you don't like who they're, being unfaithful to. And then, of course, the story actually keeps going, And the main character, this woman who is married to this annoying guy, she's actually a romance novelist in secret. I don't think he even knows that she's a romance novelist. And one of the interesting things about the story that you get is her writing a romance novel within, obviously, this book, and you get snippets of the romance novel, and it starts off very traditionally in a romance novel type of traditional setting where you have a young governess who goes to stay at this English manor during like the Victorian period or something. And of course the young girl is all innocent and beautiful but smart, or maybe not so smart, who knows. And of course she's starting to fall in love with the, you know, lord of the manor, who of course is a married man, but he has a wife who's cheating on him with like his cousin who lives over at the manor next door, you know. And it's just one of those hilarious stories because the authoress, who is the main character of Margaret Atwood's book, she slowly starts to change her perspective as she's writing this romance novel. So instead of identifying with the young girl, she eventually turns her attention over to the wife and identifies more and more with this supposedly cheating wife. And of course, this is a character who is herself cheating, or does at times cheat on her husband. And it is so interesting how you have the wife in this case, who had been the antagonist to the young love in this fake romance novel, turns into her own sort of protagonist, and eventually the antagonist turns out to be, of course, the husband. So it's such an interesting take on how we tend to, of course, associate with either the cheaters or the not cheaters, and how things tend to change depending on whose perspective you're looking at. And I think one of the things for me about storylines about cheaters is when they really are just about the couple who are either trying to reconcile, or it's about this person who's just, I'm going to try and have a mistress while also being respectful to my wife, you know, or my wife or my husband. I really just have no real interest in that type of drama. Again, I find it really depressing, and I, for the most part, usually side with the person who's being cheated on, not with the cheater. And one of the weirdest things, though, that I was realizing is I really don't like to read or to watch stories about cheating, but there are actually a number of really good songs that are from the perspective of cheaters that I actually really like. And this is one of those things where I like mentally have no way of explaining why I like these songs, apart from like the music is really good and you just kind of ignore the fact, you know, that a lot of these stories are not actually morally upright, I guess you could say. So what I've decided to do is actually start a little short Tumblr series about songs from the perspective of cheaters that for one reason or another I actually like. So, you know, I guess it all depends on, you know, the nature of the medium in which you get the story, I guess you could say. In the end, a lot of these songs are not necessarily depressing, you know. And for the most part, I think what it comes down to with the storylines about drug use or about cheating or infidelity really is just how many times they are hardcore topics and they are treated and depicted in the most depressing ways possible. I have enough depressing topics that I can dwell on, and drug use and cheating, infidelity, those are not topics that I necessarily mentally like to dwell on or think about or explore. So in the end, that's partly, majorly why I tend to avoid those storylines. So that is about it for my podcast. And I hope you look forward to find out what songs I surprisingly like, even though they're about cheating. Anywho, that is about it, and have a good evening.